there is nothing else prepared to present. It's just questions. We have here a lot of active developers, so probably Henning, it's one that everyone knows, quite long contributor. Probably Andreas, if it's still here, it's the longest after me currently here. He started, I'm not sure, before Henning, I guess, with the, how's called that, wizard for OpenSCR config file, the first artificial intelligence agent for Kamailio config file was written in like 2005 or something like that. So has been there, but I mentioned Federico, guys from SIPgate also, they did a lot with Kemi if you have questions. We have also from the company that developed Kafka and Prometheus, not the developer, but it's here. Fred, usually with the infrastructure and other things related to the project, can help if you have questions. Giacomo, I mentioned yesterday, he helped us with some testing suite. Do I miss anyone? Of course, Tom, you made the Prometheus, or you made the Prometheus, or who? No? Okay. A module. He did it probably, if I'm not mistaken. Alexander is there, SIP capture, SIP trace module, and many other contributors. Xenofon, it's hidden as well there, from like 2 years or so in the community, but very good contributions. Not only the build system that he's going to have a presentation just after this session. Dragos Ingerzan, because he lives in Berlin, probably it's late, but he should be the guy around IMS modules. So later, if you have questions, I'm pointing you to him. So yeah, let's get started, not to delay it. Questions? Who has the first one? Of course, first line here. So you don't have to ask only about me, because I can point the others.
Basically, what I'm currently doing is I'm translating some Kamailio config into Kami using the Python. And I have a couple of questions related to it. First one is mainly related to database. In Kamailio config, we use a SQL ops module to make DB queries. The question is, in Python, we have so many libraries for database connections and so on, and database management and stuff. However, we are unclear whether to use Python libraries or keep using the SQL ops, because the Kamailio is a multi-process, multi-threaded, and so on. So there was our internal discussion whether to use Python connection management. We create a connection and do it, or let the Kamailio handle the connection stuff and do the multi-threading and pooling and stuff.
So I'm not using much Python, but I see it's quite popular in the community. I'm using more Lua, but I'm not sure if I should say it's a recommendation, but my preference is to use Kamailio module, because I know what's doing, and it's kind of designed for this multi-process architecture of the project. We have some threads, but they are created after forking for some purposes, like the new multi-threaded reading for UDP, but also to communicate with other WebSockets through the client library. Because there is an issue if you don't know when the threads are created by this external library, and it happens to be done when also Kamailio forks, and those threads are looking some mutexes internally, and those states are in the middle, so not clear, not set, then you can end up in some deadlocks or kind of misbehavior. So if you do it in Python, you should do it in this kind of event routes which are executed after forking.
Yeah, just forget Python. If we do it Lua, for example, would you still recommend we use the Kamailio versions of database collection?
As I said, it's more my preference than recommendation because I don't know what those libraries do, and maybe they do better for what you need. But for my needs so far, what SQLOps provide, it's enough, and I prefer to do that.
Okay. And one more question related to this. It's mainly related to missing documentation on the Kami side, because there are many functions that exist in Kami, but we don't find it in the Kamailio. And of course, the Kamailio has many functions with optional parameters and different return values.
That was a decision which we discussed a little bit, I think, on some IRC Devel meeting at that time. And because we had support for this .NET framework with the Mono project. In those languages, you don't have optional parameters. Lua Python has it, but some of these scripting languages or programming languages don't have it. And the decision was to not make it with optional parameters, the functions for Kami exposed to Kami. And then, yes, when it's a function with options, with optional parameters in Kamailio config file, you will see like 2 or 3 or 4 functions that will have the common prefix, the usual name in the Kamailio config file, and then some suffixes like underscore URI, if a URI is an optional parameter. So practically, if you look at the prefix of the function name, you should find it in the modules README, and then the other variants which have something at the end, underscore URI or underscore mod or whatever, would be when you add another optional module parameter as to that function. Yeah, we lack documentation not only there. What we have for Kami as documentation, it's kind of auto-created with some Python script contributed, just to have like a reference pointing to the module README. But yeah, some of these functions don't go to, because they don't match by the name. So then if it's not matching by the name, you should try to match by the prefix of the name, and then see the optional parameters and figure out from the rest of the name, now it's with the optional URI parameter or optional mode parameter. That's the corresponding function. Of course, contributions to the documentation, it's always welcome.
Update the documentation.
I said it's generated, but actually for each of these functions, you can create another small markdown that is not going to be overwritten, but is going to be used to have documentation inside the larger markdown file. So some of the functions have this extra documentation text in our Kami documentation, but most of them is just like a link to the module, exporting it and trying to match the same function name.
Okay, one last question related to the variables. As you know, Kamailio have many types of variables like AVP, XAVP, XAV, and so on. Plus we have dialogues, dialogue-related variables, dialogue profiles, and so on. I think there is a PV module which exports one generic function to get or set the values of these variables. But we see that sometimes it has problem with the dialogue. It could be related to the Kamailio logic. But what do you recommend? How do we should we use dialogue specific?
Yeah, so AVPs are not per dialogue. So if you think that AVPs are per dialogue, it's wrong. AVPs and the variants with XAVP, XAVPI, and U, these are transaction context variables. So if you set them, it's only from the request to the final response in Kamailio memory, then it's destroyed. If you load the dialogue module, there is the DLG var variable. So that would be to keep some value from invite to the buy.
Yeah, exactly.
And then what I use quite a lot, because it's not always when I like to load the dialog module, it's hash table. In a hash table, you can use like call ID or from tag, to tag, or combination of them to keep values there for the duration of the call. But you do it a bit more kind of manually. When you get the by, you will have to delete it. Or the alternative is to set an expire, and will be automatically deleted when that expiration time goes. So for dialog duration, use DLG var or hash table. For transaction, use AVPs and the variants with XAVP.
And the problem I observed during my testing was that for dialog variables, if I use the DLG var, it sometimes does not work. If I use ksrpv.get or set, they work always somehow. I don't know.
Yeah,
I do understand
because
they should not work with the dialog, but somehow they work. But the dialog ones are not very reliable. Maybe it's a bug, or I don't know.
Depending how you use it, sometimes you need to use a function that finds the dialog. So if you do it like in a reply route before the response is handled through the dialog module, it's practically the dialog is not known at that moment. So there are like function DLG get or something like that that will look up that dialog and will set it like this is the dialog associated with this response. So it's why the variables is more like set get values, but the functions we exported to the query probably is searching for the dialog because it's different kind of implementation behind. So if the dialog is not found, probably the set of the variable for it is not yet found. The dialog variable it's also not set. So try to use this DLG get, or I don't remember.
I'll further investigate because right now I'm just translating it.
Okay.
Once I am done, then I'll do more research on it. But this is the main problem I get with the dialogues. Thank you.
Okay. We have Tyler.
Thank you. My question was around concurrency. So we did some load testing recently, and we found that the CPS was we could push that to limits and basically saturate the NIC. But on concurrent calls, we were kind of maxing out at around 20K. At that point, it started getting timeouts. I was just wondering if there's any insights you had on how to improve that or how to kind of debug a little bit further.
The question is, it saturates because you load the dialog module, or to keep the list of that dialogues, or
this is on like
saturated?
a stateless, just dispatcher, like a vanilla config.
But then we don't keep anything for active calls. So where you find the limit, it's throwing what out of memory?
It's on like concurrent calls. It's starting to get timeouts. So at like 20,000 calls, that's when we start to see these timeouts occur.
Yeah, but if you download the dialog module and you don't use like an RTP engine, RTP proxy for relaying, then Kamailio doesn't keep anything for active calls. So it should not impact, should be something else like maybe blocking to some database operation or DNS query. But if the invite was answered with 200 OK and the ACK was passing also, then till the buy, Kamailio doesn't keep anything in memory. So it should be like if you start 20,000 calls, they are completed, and then you look at Kamailio memory, besides the usual data that is there for LCR or dispatcher, there is nothing about active calls. You can restart it, and then the buy can go fine through the route and contacts that were exchanged during the invite. So there is something else there that you start getting timeouts. Kamailio, it's blocked maybe DNS or database query, or because, as I said, if you just use dispatcher, I don't see a reason on.
Okay, so that might just be like a resource allocation type issue. Inspect at like the Kamailio level.
Fred wants to say something.
Yeah, I mean, is it UDP or TCP or TLS? All right, so yeah, on UDP, especially if you said, because you said stateless, I mean, it should be unlimited. Because as Daniel was saying, I mean, when the number of simultaneous calls is insignificant. It's the setup. So it depends on what you're seeing timeouts with or anything like that. When you start getting into 20,000 calls or pushing calls per second, you start seeing some, network considerations on packets per second and things like that.
If you send like 20,000 calls at once, like new call setups, then maybe you have to look at the buffers for the network sockets. You might need to increase the limits because they can get filled. Yeah,
that's at like 2K CPS.
Tom wants to say something.
So I understood you're using TCP, right? UDP, sorry. Then I misunderstood. Okay, sorry.
It's UFA. UFA wants to.
Yeah, like Daniel said, the concurrent calls number basically doesn't really matter for Kamailio because it's just actually processing messages. But if you're actually throttled by the CPS, then probably you need to consider tuning the OS parameters and some Kamailio parameters like the buffer size and stuff like that. That will help significantly. And also another thing I found that throttles the CPS performance is logging. That does matter a lot.
Yeah, that's a good point, you think. Yeah, logging could be if you write a log for each new invite and so on, and you can configure syslog in asynchronous mode. Could be that one. So check, as I said, network queues, logging now, and okay, Ihor, we are missing you. You should have been the second after. You are second row.
Yeah, my question would be about the memory manager. And if I'm using the counter for the all shared memory, it's giving me one number. But if I'm using it split it by modules, means it doesn't sum up. Means somewhere there is sometimes, and sometimes, for example, shared memory counter just grows for like no good reason. So what would be the best way to find out where the actually memory leak? And just given that sometimes it's happening like on a production system and under more or less load. So is there any non-disruptive way to find the possible memory leak?
There is one that gives a summary, so don't dump the status, which makes per each chunk. We'll do this summary, which will match the chunks and will give the count of the chunks from the same place. And there is the option now for commands to write to a file, not to give it to the terminal, like RPC commands. So if you want to, let's say, dump user location content, and if you have many active users, then it might end up in throwing errors or using too much memory to build the RPC JSON response. So for these cases, there is an option to write to a file. So I'm not sure if ChemCTL or ChemCLI has the option, but it's in the RPC kind of an extension. If you provide the parameter in the RPC request where to write it, then it should be written in a file. And I think it's kind of generic, should work for all the RPC commands. Those that dump the status, anyhow, I think they write to syslog. But there are some of them that gives it back to the like sender of the RPC command. Why it's the difference? I haven't developed the one per modules, but that's also not really per module, it's per component. So the code it's also, and libraries I think are different components because it's more like matching on the prefix. So I'm not sure exactly. I use it from time to time because when I want to look at a module, it's very useful, but I never look like if the sum of all modules loaded and other components, it's matching the other ones. So if it's not matching, then it's an arithmetic problem somewhere. Okay. Maybe 1, 2 more questions. David?
Hello. Has it been considered any time to use Redis as backend for dispatcher module?
Andreas wrote DB Redis, right? And should work. But it's still going to load in Kamailio memory. So if you want like use always the Redis data, then it's not working. But you can use Redis as a replacement for MySQL, for example, to authentication as well, not only dispatcher, so the other modules. Now, as far as I remember, you need to define some schema mapping there because Redis is key value storage. So, but it's in the documentation and some examples there. I use it for permission, for example, instead of address table in the database.
With the DB Redis module, we could define a schema for dispatcher also.
Yeah.
Okay.
So should be no problem. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
DB Redis. Last chance because then it's Xenofon gonna answer your all questions. The last one from Muhammad here again, the first row. He wants to finish the quota for today in the first session. 5 questions for a fair.
Okay. Speaking of Redis, we noticed a problem that we want to use Redis for the location data, and we noticed there is a problem that it runs a Kamailio process to clean up the registrations. And this shoots up the CPU, you know, the processing a lot. And we were wondering if it is possible to Redis already has an expiry. So if we can use the expiry function for the Redis instead of using the Kamailio cleaner process to clean it.
Yeah, because I mean, DB Redis, it's actually independent of the module using it, so doesn't do anything specific for user local authentication. So it's just like a connector module, like would be with the database. So the process it's in the user lock module doesn't have to do anything with DB Redis. And there was at some point, but it was not merged because it was not finished. It was a module called USR lock _ Redis, which tried to make it use Redis with its capability for user location record. Mm-hmm. So now it's not possible, but the code is on GitHub, so okay. You can contribute.
Probably have
to
to.
it. But then there are this, if you use like DB mode 3, which is database only, should be no timer. No, it's still a timer for those that unregister, but if a phone unregisters, then will be automatically, or at that time, deleted. Is this mode 2, I think, which is the one that queues in memory the changes and applies them in a process. But for cleanup, because some phones disappear, they don't unregister, it's still a timer running periodically. So, but yeah. You'll have to make a module specific for user lock to take the expires from the header and put it there.
We were wondering
while DB Redis, it's just generic connect.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So not to start again with the delays in the morning. I'm inviting here Xenofon. I think I'm right in the schedule.